Welcome to Legal Meets, a look at legal beyond the law. A podcast by Legaler.
On this episode of Legal Meets, we meet Michael Bacina, partner at Piper Alderman and lawyer to many of Australia's biggest blockchain projects. With his knowledge of computer science and cryptoeconomics, Michael has a keen understanding of the various needs of startups looking to build distributed ledger technology.
Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Legal Meets. I am joined by Michael Bacina in Sydney, Australia. Welcome, Michael.
Good morning, Stevie.
Thanks for making time out of your busy day. You've become a thought leader of, not just of late, but across the blockchain industry from a legal perspective. And we've shared a couple of panels together recently. And you're a very, very busy man, so I've been lucky enough to pin you down. So thank you for making time out of your busy day.
Not at all, Stevie.
And generally, we like to start off Legal Meets by getting a view inside the life of the lawyer and behind the scenes. So if TED Talk got in touch with you tomorrow and said, Michael, we want you to present, but you can't talk about being a lawyer, what would you actually talk about?
That's a tricky one, Stevie. I think outside of law, I really enjoy swimming and diving and water sports. So if I had to give a TED Talk that didn't involve law and let's say not involve blockchain, I think I would probably want to talk about the ocean and swimming and what we can learn from that ecosystem.
So you're fortunate by beautiful Sydney Harbour and Manly's beaches. So do you have a pre-work routine or do you duck away during your lunch break to try and keep sane?
Oh, look, if I'm lucky enough and the weather is cooperative, I can take a quick run down to Boy Charlton Pool, which is just on the edge of our beautiful Botanic Gardens here in Sydney. And down on the weekends, I can be found at Manly having a swim. And if I'm lucky enough during the week, I can sometimes have some meetings down there. We might be able to make Blockchain Beach a hashtag eventually. We just need to keep working on it down there.
You got to keep championing Blockchain Island in Malta, so Blockchain Beach might.
I think Noose is trying to be Blockchain Coast or something.
Oh, that's right. There's a conference coming up.
Or Crypto Coast, sorry.
That's right. Okay, cool. We'll give him that one. And so, how did you actually end up becoming a lawyer? What dragged you down this path? So I know you've had a tech penchant most of your life, but what made you want to become a lawyer?
Look, I think like many students in Australia, when we graduate from high school, we're driven by getting, as it was then, the TER, figuring out what course we could do. It was always understood in my family that I'd be going into some higher education, and just a question of what that would be. And I guess I had to make a choice at some point between something like medicine or law, and I'd always watched heaps of excellent legal programming my whole life, like Boston Legal and great other shows. And I'd always been attracted to how rules are implemented in society and how they govern business. My family, my father ran a small import-export business of perfumery out of our house, so I was exposed to entrepreneurship at a very young age. So I've always been really interested in the journey of businesses and how they're regulated. So law just seemed to be an obvious grounding. I ran a startup during my law studies, so I was always get involved in that space and was lucky enough to exit it just before entering practice as a lawyer full time. So over the years, my legal practice has skewed towards technology, and then in the last few years, just heavily in blockchain because it's such an exciting and interesting field.
And so now you're blockchain cryptocurrency practice at Piper Alderman. Is it the oldest major law firm in Australia?
Yes. So we trace our founding back to the 1840s in Adelaide. So my best reckoning is we are the oldest major law firm and quite possibly the second oldest law firm in the entire country. There's a very small one in Tasmania that I think beats us by a couple of years, but it's fantastic to be working in such a new and exciting area while also being part of a firm with this kind of history behind it.
And so Piper Alderman made some waves as one of the first major law firms, I think the first major law firm in Australia at least, to actually accept cryptocurrencies as a form of payment. And so that's been part and parcel driven by client demand, and you're representing some major Australian blockchain projects like Liven, Independent Reserve, Loki, which had a really successful raise. And so what drew your practice to this area? It's something quite new across the world. Bitcoin's only been around for 10 years in terms of blockchain technology, which we just celebrated the 10-year anniversary on October 31st of the white paper. But what brought your practice specifically to this domain?
Well, I remember when the Ethereum project first came out and there was a lot of discussion around smart contracts, just my interest in tech put it on my radar. And a few clients had spoken about Bitcoin years prior, and I said, well, that looks kind of interesting, but looks like just an odd little quirky project. I was very busy on some large litigation at the time, and of course, if I was able to go back in time now, I'd spend more time buying up lots of Bitcoin then. But I had a bit of interest in these smart contracts, thought they were interesting, posted a couple of things online about them saying these are really fascinating in terms of what they might be able to do, obviously really early stages. And from those posts, I was hunted down by some conference organizers the end of 2016 to say, could I come and do some education to lawyers? To which I, of course, said, can't you find somebody else who knows more than this than me? Because I really don't know very much at all. They said, no, you seem to be it. And I said, all right, well, I'll come along and present. And they said, well, that's fantastic. Can you please write us a paper? So, of course, I said, yeah, that's fine. Ended up taking off the best part of a week to immerse myself in the intricacies of smart contracts and all the projects going on then. And I suppose only took a pause in that week to go and set up a bunch of accounts and buy a pile of cryptocurrency and see how it actually works. And then well, that's right. And then from that initial conference where some lawyers said, look, we don't understand this at all, but we have some clients who are operating in that space. Can you help them? Then things have grown from there. Now to the point where I'm leading the blockchain team at Piper Alderman. We have staff in Adelaide, Sydney, and Brisbane working on blockchain projects, very focused on the business development side of projects that are building up in the blockchain space, not just in cryptocurrencies, but also deploying these projects at enterprise level as well. So there's a lot of really exciting stuff, and it's going to be like the internet again, and a really 10 to 20 year journey, hopefully a little faster, but it's going to take that long to go through the economies of the world. And if it's not done right, there's going to be pushback from governments and other regulators. And I think that lawyers can and should play a really important role in ensuring that these revolutionary technological advancements step at the appropriate speed and make sure that the policy goals are met as they come along. So that's how I see our role. I've also, as I mentioned, had a lot of experience to entrepreneurship growing up. One of the things that satisfies me most in my legal practice is not only solving problems for clients, but also helping to see and play a small part in my clients' growth and success. So I really enjoy seeing projects build up. I've been fortunate enough to have known you for quite a long part of your blockchain journey, and it was a great satisfaction to see how far you've come along in that period. The whole industry has grown up fast and had a lot of growing pains already, which we've seen to date. But it's really exciting to see it finding its feet now, having a bit of consolidation and moving on to focus on really great projects.
And you've spent a lot of your time, around thought leadership and educating people, and it's no stretch to say you become one of the leading voices, especially from a legal perspective, on smart contracts and blockchain and ICOs in Australia and across the world now. So, for lawyers, what do you think is so fascinating about this new technology? We've got, this confluence of a societal shift, whether blockchain can affect governments, different ways of thinking about democracy. We've got the regulatory shift. We've got the commercial shift in terms of what it's doing as whether it's cryptocurrencies or an area of technological growth. Why do you think this is so fascinating, and why should lawyers especially be paying attention right now?
Well, I think, Stevie, you've almost answered your own question. There's so much potential for fundamental change in how business is done. There's been a lot of talk of automation in the last 20 years and artificial intelligence. The promises of that have not met up to the hype so far, but in fairness, neither has the promises of blockchain quite yet. But in blockchain tech, and certainly in cryptocurrencies, the real world deployment and the accessibility of the technology is more readily achievable than some of the really complicated artificial intelligence, which is being worked on. I mean, you look at Google's projects of having the assistant make telephone calls for people and book a hair appointment or a restaurant reservation. You know, the resources of Google were acquired in a pretty significant way to have 3 use cases work, sort of, for a machine making phone calls and pretending to be a human. And those things are going to come along, but the ability for people to organize a group of people, access tools through a blockchain platform to even conduct something as simple as, say, collect the votes for the local soccer association or some club, and be able to access governance and record keeping, which previously were really painful things that no one wanted to do, and have been the source of lots of disputes. And when lawyers have to get involved and look at how bad records have been kept and the absence of evidence, which creates problems in people being able to enforce their rights, blockchain creates a real opportunity to lower the cost and barriers to access things that previously needed an intermediary to do. And that's, in my view, similar to back in the really old days when it cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars, adjusted for inflation, thousands and thousands of dollars to get an accountant to update spreadsheets before things like Excel got invented. And all a program like Excel did was massively reduce the cost and increase the accessibility to everyone of a really fantastic way of doing calculations and planning and do all kinds of other useful things. And blockchain is no different to that. There are certain things we do now that you have to pay for, which I'm pretty sure that the service providers don't really enjoy them either. And so blockchain is a way of helping to bring out, get rid of those dull things that we don't like to do, or be able to have higher levels of compliance and auditable record keeping so that we can have confidence in business and in clubs and associations and other things. And these are all areas in the governance space that lawyers are and should be interested in, particularly in the corporate space, because they're a source of ongoing work and advice and guidance. So I think that there's also the fact that it's a really exciting space which poses the opportunity for significant change. I mean, the social impact for blockchain for social impact meetup in Sydney, I think, was massively over-attended. WWF are doing some fantastic pilots to help reduce slavery and track supply chain of tuna. This is not a technology which is limited to some dry legal topic like an M&A or tax or what have you. It touches so many different other areas and have so many different use cases and exciting applications that almost no matter what someone is interested in, even from a legal perspective, there will be some impact of blockchain in the future. So I think all young lawyers should be working out how they can understand this tech, even if from no other reason than when they start to encounter future legal apps or dApps that might be available on some kind of excellent legally focused blockchain in the future, then they will be ready to use that. They won't be part of the people who are resistant to change, those who said when the internet first launched, this will all blow over, this is unnecessary, or those who said there's maybe a worldwide market for 10 computers back in the day. I think it's about being future ready, and blockchain is certainly a lot more accessible than artificial intelligence, which a lot of lawyers struggle to say, well, how are we going to try and understand this and get around it? It is so far off the scale of something we can understand as lawyers that it's just not worth putting the time into to try and figure it out. Let's just figure out what we can do with some of the deployments of that.
Just in the name of smart contracts and a lawyer as your core commodity, dealing with contracts, and some argue that the core commodity hasn't changed since either Hammurabi's Code of Hammurabi or the actual clay tablets that kind of represent the first ledgers going back 5,000 years. Now is a real shift in terms of it's often said smart contracts and neither contracts nor smart, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that's also, I think, one reason why it's resonating so much with the legal industry, to kind of see where that's going. Quite often when I'm talking about blockchain technology, I think it's more exciting to talk about not so much the what, which I'll get you to kind of jump into also, but the why. And I think it goes back to basically this question of trust and how we as a society have actually created trust and the different trust technologies. And the early technologies were simple things like kinship and family and giving and all kinds of different things that we don't really think about as forms of trust. But as we move out of our tribes and we kind of escalated past what they call Dunbar's number, the 150 people that you and I can easily remember and relate to and trust,
things got complicated, so we started using intermediaries, and from there, we brought all different types of technologies in between us. So the same way, I guess, Bitcoin used a decentralized network of computers to kind of get rid of those intermediaries, we can apply that to every different fabric, again, of society, from voting to contracts to business commercial relationships. And that's really, I think, fascinating. So I guess for those playing at home, do you want to just, maybe from a lawyer's perspective, just describe what is this blockchain thing, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit about what smart contracts are.
Well, at its simplest, a blockchain is just a database, an expensive, slow, very hard to alter, very secure database. Exactly, but fundamentally that's it, right? In examples of the presentations, I say, try and think of it like a read-only Excel spreadsheet that you can never turn track changes that you can never turn track changes off, so you can always see the changes that have been made. Because conceptually, we don't need to get into the really nuts and bolts of how it operates at a technical level, nor do we have time. But those concepts around that of how it can give that kind of protection, so you can trust the technology to ensure that the data is reliable. And I think it's really unfortunate that it's been referred to as a trustless system, but which is focusing on the users not needing to trust each other's. I actually think it's better to refer to it as a trusted system, because we're already used to trusting systems. We all trust Facebook, somewhat foolishly as it turns out, and we all trust other platforms right now. I am trusting the Legaler platform right now to deliver the video to you and record it appropriately and not to put words in my mouth. So we all have to trust something or someone. And so indirectly, I'm trusting the developers of Legaler to ensure that it works. In the same way, blockchain involves trusting the developers to have built something that works in the way they say. But interestingly, important thing to understand about blockchain is the very open source nature of it means that you don't have to trust that someone represents the system does what it says, because other people can verify it for you to say, we have read the code. It does in fact do what it says it does, in a way that you can't do with traditional software like Word or Excel. We can't see the source code under the hood of those pieces of software to ensure they're not taking a copy of what we type and sending it off.
We say there's no such thing as 100% truth. So in terms of what you just described, it sounds like the most important thing is basically trust by consensus. And that's where obviously these consensus algorithms come in. But essentially you're creating a network of computers that are tied in together, and they decide on the truth basically by a majority, in a sense. So
that's right.
The general protocol, yeah.
And there's a really good example that was given by a developer at a panel I was at recently, who said, think about the children's game Telephone, or Chinese Whispers as it was called, where you start with a circle of kids and you put the statement, whisper it to the first kid. It goes around the circle until that was always one. Somebody decides to change it for hilarity. And if you think about a blockchain, another way of considering it simplified is the game of Chinese Whispers or telephones, but instead of the phrase being whispered from person to person, after it's whispered, the next person shouts out what the phrase is, so the entire group hears it. So by the time you reach the end, everyone in the group has heard the phrase countless times. It's not much fun as a game anymore, but in terms of understanding how the blockchain system manages to verify things, I think it's quite accurate to give you that idea, and understanding that you reach consensus with a group of people. And strictly speaking, on a lot of blockchains, to push the metaphor, if half the people in the group agree the phrase is what they all shouted out along the way, then it's taken to be true. Well, that's right. It's simply saying if enough people agree, then that is correct. And it's no different to saying, well, we add up the votes for an election. US is about to be voting in its midterms, and we all agree that the winner is the person decided by the number of votes, or the country reaches a consensus on who will lead it for the next period of time.
And so now you can do that, I guess, in a transparent kind of way. So, bless you. So basically, Ethereum came along 2013, and Vitalik Buterin, who was quite, he was involved in Bitcoin's development as well in the earlier days, but he essentially thought of a use case that, I guess, evolved the thinking behind these new infrastructures that were created as these blockchains, and thought if you had like a computation layer on top, we could create something called a smart contract. As a Turing complete form of scripting, you could actually basically say, if this, then that, and then you can decentralize that. So whatever you put into play could actually be, your hands were taken off that. You could actually create things like escrow and release bits of code that could actually execute without one person being in charge of them. So smart contracts came along, and I like you gave the analogy of a vending machine. Is that a good way for lawyers to kind of think of, but just to frame what it kind of does in a very limited capacity?
That's right. It's the best example. As you pointed out before, smart contracts are neither smart and they're usually not contracts. They're just a way of automating parts of a transaction. It's already done today. When you put your credit card into any website, there's no person checking your card number. It's all automated on a machine. So one form of considering smart contracts is your classic vending machine or online terms and conditions or online credit card processing or anything which is an automated part of a contract being processed by machines. The key difference in smart contracts in the blockchain sense is the automation itself is decentralized and for the most part cannot be stopped or controlled. There is smart contracts with voting mechanisms to update the code so that we can avoid some of the problems that happened last year with hacks that were exploiting poorly written smart contracts, and that's going to help, I think, a great deal in the development. But the critical part, I think, to understand is by decentralizing it, you're removing the verification of whether or not the outcome should be one thing or another from the parties to the contract to the crowd. So, to push the analogy further, you're giving the children in the circle, all of them, a copy of a contract, hoping they're all legally qualified, and asking them what should occur as a result of clause 7 or what have you. Have a look at the facts. You all should be able to look at the common facts. What should the outcome be? And we'll take a vote, and whoever agrees majority of what should occur, that's what we will take as the output from that situation. So it gets pretty complicated pretty fast from a programming perspective, but thinking about it for lawyers in terms of escrow is often an easy way of considering it as well, to say one thing that lawyers, I think it's fair to assume, dislike is the trust account audits and the amount to which lawyers' trust accounts are used for sales of business, other transactions, property and whatnot, money moving through those trust accounts. Those may very well go in the next few years. Escrow was one of the very first and easiest deployments of a smart contract where a cryptographic representation of money could be placed inside the smart contract code itself on the blockchain, so no one party is in control of that money. You do not need the lawyer anymore to be trusted not to steal the money because the computers can look after it. And under a very simple escrow smart contract, say a 2 to sign, those funds simply cannot be released unless both passwords are entered. So you have a programmatically secure 2 keys to turn. It's like having a digital version of a safety deposit box, but it's accessible 24/7 anywhere in the world. And you can pre-program where the money that's in that smart contract is going to be released to and under what circumstances it'll be released if you want to make it more complicated. This is a huge game changer alone in being able to say, great, do you want to lend people money? Have some conditions that can attach to that for the release of tranches of funds. Prior to releasing it, a smart contract could check in and see if there's any lawsuits or something against a company if it's going to lend further cash. If it's a transaction, has a lawyer entered their password to sign off that the transaction is okay before funds are released? Is a deposit being forfeited? I mean, the example that often is made by some of my American fellow attorneys is renting a car, and if the money paid into the account for the car rental runs out, the smart contract could notify the car to turn itself off or lock itself and not do anything further. The point is automation around smart contracts, and it's really taking the intention of the parties and their bargain and automating however much of it that we can, which we already do now, but it's doing it in a way that means you don't need to have a third party responsible for processing that with the fees that go along with that. You can pay the fees to a crowd to operate and process that smart contract. And things like supply chain, perfect use case for it, to say if certain things are scanned into the supply chain, which can only be done if the goods are at a certain location by a certain time. Maybe there's payment based on beating performance targets. You don't need to be submitting things like Excel spreadsheets and pieces of paper to prove that something was done and secure some additional payments. So in things like the construction industries, being able to ensure payments going through all the way down to subcontractors, which is a classic problem that lawyers face all the time, that can be done. Having a really reliable record of payments going in and out of a business for tax purposes, which cannot be altered easily, is a double-edged sword. Accountants like to be able to classify things in certain ways and work out how the tax is going to be done, the accounts are going to be done, which is completely legitimate and legal. Mistakes need to be corrected, but also being able to build basic bookkeeping information into automated systems which are decentralized is yet another way of making people's lives easier and eliminating a job which frankly is not very exciting and is fairly dull. And once upon a time, the Luddites drove fork trucks into the ocean to protest their replacement with those forklifts. But if we never brought in the forklifts and then the standardized shipping container, we wouldn't enjoy the standard of living we have today. So there's always a fear that people have is that, oh, this is going to replace me. And I think that people shouldn't have that, and lawyers shouldn't have that. They should merely say, this is a tool that lets me do things better.
And that's where I think those examples that you gave can be applied to so many different scenarios, from property settlement, derivatives. And again, it goes back to this removing of intermediaries, because you can actually have these peer-to-peer transactions that can be programmed, and you have this programmable money that can actually facilitate that. So for, I guess, the lawyers playing at home that think, smart contracts might be going away, we've recently had the Australian National Blockchain locally announced in Australia, which is a collaboration between Data61 at CSIRO and IBM, and HSF and KWM. So there's law firms working on that. There's the integration that just was announced between Rocket Lawyer and Open Law. On the other side, you've got one of the biggest consumer platforms, LegalZoom, that's integrated with Clause. Again, part of the Accord project that you're familiar with. So these things aren't going away, and it's almost a race now to see if it's the lawyers or the consumers that are going to adopt these technologies first. Because if I'm going to a platform that is a consumer-facing platform and I want to create a lease with someone that I maybe know, that might be the first area that I might use a smart contract for, as a consumer. And again, that might somewhat be disrupting a lawyer, but when something goes wrong, then obviously you want to have it's a lawyer that's going to be dealing with that. And I think it's also important to note for lawyers that smart contracts might sound completely binary, but there's different layers of technology evolving. So the decentralization, to me, is the key, but you've also got different layers of technology that can actually, now you've got oracles that let you actually verify something before you let it execute completely. So you're still using decentralized data source, and it's coming into an area that can transparently be seen, but then you're able to execute that. So there's different layers. There's SageWise that's working on an SDK, a wrapper around the smart contract. So you and I making a contract, Michael can say, if something does go wrong, let's send it to this court for a dispute. Or if something does go wrong, let's be able to push a pause button so that the DAO hack that occurred for 70 odd million or more doesn't actually happen. So it's not so binary. So it's at the earlier days, but where do you see the early use cases, like in terms of for you tomorrow in your law firm? Where do you think the first use cases of smart contracts will come? Obviously, ICOs are one. Is that kind of where you're seeing the most? I guess there's $20 billion plus that's been raised.
Well, that's been one of the early use cases of the Ethereum smart contracts, and we all saw the huge rush of money in last year. And I think that a lot of those projects effectively put out tokens which were trying to represent value in the size of a network. So not only were they tackling a particularly hard project, i.e. building a network like Bitcoin or Ethereum that had to have a huge number of users in order to have value in the network itself, but trying to pre-sell access to the network with a token. And there's an amusing video going around about Lemon Coin in recent days. A guy goes up to the store and says, "I'd like to buy some lemonade. Here's $1." And the other guy says, "Get your centralized fiat currency away. You have to pay with Lemon Coin." I think there's a whole lot of projects that are discovering that if you're in the business of trying to reduce friction for your end user and customer and make things more efficient, artificially inserting a need to use a token turns out to not be the best thing for driving adoption. And if your entire business model relies around getting a huge number of users to be using that token within a platform, the harder it is to obtain the token and use it, the more likely you are to fail. And that's just adding on all the further risks to the usual business risks in a startup approach. So I think that it's been economically a fantastic thing for the ecosystem to have the flood of money which came in as it did, but it's a double-edged sword. It's also been quite bad in that there's been a whole lot of scams. And I mean, even just, I think yesterday there was reports that someone had, obviously not Elon Musk's Twitter account, had just changed the name to Elon Musk, saying, please send me some Bitcoin and I'll send you back more. It's a classic scam. It's been described as the dumbest scam ever. But I think even as of yesterday, they'd collected 29 Bitcoin in the account from people who are just idiots, sending money to someone who is patently obviously a scam. And that's a really low-grade scam. So there's always going to be scammers anywhere. I think that the SEC just promised as well the other day clearer guidance on ICOs, but I think we've seen a lot of the funds who perhaps were getting involved in the bubble of ICOs, if you will, as they came up, moving to a position of saying, well, tokenization has always existed for companies. They're called shares. They may be a better long-term bet. Is there a place for tokens which represent financial value in a business? 100%. What will they look like in the future? That's still being settled. So there's a whole lot of talk, of course, around issuing tokens which are in fact securities or which exhibit security-like features. And we have this sort of binary distinction between so-called utility tokens and so-called security tokens, both of which are terrible descriptions that I hear being used in inappropriate ways all the time. I think that there's a better categorization out there that needs to reach a consensus in the blockchain community of how tokens should be treated, because they're so infinitely programmable and be able to be dealt with in different ways that in many ways they defy classification. I think that's driven to this bifurcation of how they should be described. But the reality is that people who want to be investing money in businesses tend to want to have some ownership in them, or have something which represents a claim on an asset or a claim on future revenue. And those things are plainly financial products. And there's a reason why we have frameworks around that. Those frameworks may need to evolve over time because of the nature of the technology we have, reduces the need for intermediaries and can take away issues like custody problems and clearing issues to have instantaneous clearing, which have been features of our financial markets for many, many years because they weren't technologically able to be done in the way that blockchain can do it. So that's a fascinating way forward. But I think that ICOs, as we've seen them, are certainly considered by many to be on the out. I think there'll always be a space for certain projects. I mean, there's certain things that lend themselves very, very well to tokens that are 100% not securities. There's no reason why ticketing to every single event could not be done on cryptographic tokens now. Much more secure. It immediately kills the scalping market for those jurisdictions that don't want to have opportunities for scalping. Similarly, loyalty points are a fantastic use case for using a cryptographic token so that you can avoid the inevitable problem with airline points, which are always depreciating in value because the airline can always issue more points. Those are really great examples. So there's still great use cases for tokens that aren't going to be falling on, I think, foul of securities laws. But I think that the huge opportunity in the next few years is for these what's called as security tokens, and helping to tokenize actual securities which are out there and bring potential for greater liquidity to investors in a regulated way that also protects those investors and perhaps even opens up markets for smaller investors that they couldn't have access to before.
One more layer. So I imagine on a daily basis, people are calling you and saying, hey, I want to do an ICO or some kind of fundraising mechanism. Just let's call it crowdfunding, because essentially that's what it is. It just depends on kind of what you're selling. Or it could be the opposite. It could be, as you mentioned, an existing security or some type of business model that is a security and you want to tokenize that. Going back to what blockchain affords us, we've got this digital scarcity now, so we can create something unique, a one-off something, so that you can create one of a share that can't be replicated. So that works. So just take me through, a client walks in and says, Michael, I want to do this. What are generally the avenues? And I think you touched on most of it there, but essentially when they describe their business, what does someone need to keep in mind so that they can kind of get a better framework of, is what I'm doing a security, is what I'm doing a utility token? Because we actually had this on one of the panels that you and I were both on, where maybe I posed the question that do we need new laws to kind of wrap around this new technology? And maybe there are some areas that we do, but essentially there are a lot of existing frameworks all across the world. And Jay Clayton, the SEC chairman, famously said that every ICO I've seen is a security, and they created all all kinds of, it was a bit of a blanket statement and created all kinds of concerns for the US market. But what is the thinking? And if I walk into your office tomorrow and say, Mike, this is what I want to do, what are the doors that I can walk through, and why would I walk through those doors?
Well, I think similar to every client who comes to see a lawyer, I want to find out why people are looking to do any project and what their end goal is. It's business planning 101. And I think that there's certainly projects which have decided that they want to do a token because they want to raise money and they've seen all this money being raised, and that's not the right reason to be getting into any kind of token sale. I think that if someone is coming in and saying, oh, I have a genuine need for a token, I've seen countless projects and spoken to them in early stages saying, I just don't understand what the need for your token is within your business model. The classic question is to say, why can't you just do it with a token that already exists? Why can't you build something that will be using blockchain? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people were creating tokens because it was seen as a way of raising money. And certainly in 2017 and out of America and many projects around the world, was seen as a way of raising money that wasn't diluting equity, but the real value being created in the short run was in the company that wasn't issuing any equity, because that was the company that was going to be building the thing. If they were going to be open sourcing everything, well, they're handing away the IP being created and committing to try and create the value in the network itself. But I think coming back to that main point to say, what is it you're trying to achieve? Are you trying to build some valuable IP in a company which will do something? Are you trying to create something that's going to be 100% decentralized one day and all the value is going to be handed to a community? What is it you're selling? What are the rights and obligations that you're trying to parcel out to people? Are you trying to take an asset and slice it up? Because from that position, and in particular what the end goal is or the end exit, everything else can be pulled back. And a lot of different questions flow. I mean, it's entirely different from someone who says, I want to run a ticketing platform that's going to sell tickets to concerts and take on the major providers. And we're going to use cryptographic tokens and people's phones to have no paper tickets anymore. It's going to be all really awesome. Someone saying, I just want to raise a bunch of money and then I'm going to build a platform and people will use this token to access my platform. On the former, I'll say, that's great. We're dealing with a pure blockchain deployment. Your tokens are going to represent things later. They'll probably be non-fungible. There's certain things you might have around regulation. On the latter, I'd say, okay, well, you're trying to do something that regulators have expressed concern with. We need to look at it pretty closely. We're fortunate in Australia that we've had, public statements from ASIC that there are tokens which are not financial products, and I think I've given a couple of examples of that. But there are a whole lot which start to look very much like financial products or securities. I think the saying, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and looks like a duck, it's probably a security duck. There's a whole lot of a lack of understanding, and I think we saw earlier this year the press release from ASIC about the number of projects they've gone and shut down because they've seen people advertising who weren't necessarily doing it as a scam. I think in many of these cases they just didn't understand, and so it was more of an issue of, to date, people wishing to raise money have had to go through gatekeepers and intermediaries, and the blockchain technology allowing people to cut out those intermediaries, perhaps they cut them out too fast and didn't realize what they were doing was illegal. Much as in the early days of the internet, it was so incredibly easy for people to pirate music. They did. And people didn't think about it in terms of, I am committing a crime. But they were. And over time, that hasn't become any less illegal. We're fortunate that the technology has changed to put affordable streaming in place. So all of that criminal behavior has become, for the most part, non-criminal. And similarly, I think that the blockchain space is evolving. So most of the projects that we're speaking to now are looking at some kind of tokenization of a security. And the projects you see reported in AFR, where they're issuing shares which have a token with them in case the token is used later on, seems to be a popular way of doing things now. I think that the focus is more moving towards the technology itself and building projects that can generate value themselves, rather than here is a project which needs to use a token in order to run itself. And that's not to say there aren't really valuable projects that have that as a core feature. They just have to be really carefully thought out about how it goes into the system. And I think they tend to sort of sit around where there's a need to have that protocol layer that needs a token to power the system and incentivize people to run it, versus a lot of projects, other projects really should be being built as dApps on top of some kind of protocol like that, or having some kind of deployment that doesn't need tokenization. When Data 61 and Commonwealth Bank got together to talked to the government about putting all the NDIS transaction records on Ethereum, they didn't include in their plan, we're going to issue an NDIS token in order to pay for all this. They said, no, we can use the power of blockchain to do fantastic auditing and make what is a problem now and a friction point much better auditability, reduce fraud. That's still there for blockchain technology, and I think that's going to be quite big for the next few years.
It's like if I remove this token from that ecosystem or this project, it should almost fail, right? It should be so necessary to that project succeeding and to the underpinnings of how that ecosystem is incentivized and whatever else, that it should work. And the other side is what you described as existing financial products that are coming in under a different guise. So it sounds like being fair to ASIC, which is for those listeners in the US, our SEC, they essentially are really concerned about consumers, not so much, it's nothing really saying cryptocurrency is evil. That they're really, and I think the ACCC has actually given rights to ASIC to actually enforce some protections and action against projects that are seen to be somewhat, missing a few steps in what they're offering and not declaring certain things publicly.
Well, Stevie, I'll jump in there. Yeah. So the delegation, our Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, has jurisdiction for misleading and deceptive conduct. For those overseas viewers, Australia has some of the strongest laws in the world prohibiting misleading and deceptive conduct by those engaged in business. So before the delegation, ASIC, our version of the SEC, would have needed to show that a project was in fact a security in order to then move to say you have engaged in misleading and deceptive conduct. By having the ACCC delegate its powers across, assuming that delegation is constitutional and valid, then ASIC doesn't need to do that. So a similar way, or the analogy would be the SEC wouldn't even need to allege something as a security. They could simply walk in and say, we have jurisdiction over misleading and deceptive conduct in this space, full stop. We think you're engaging in misleading and deceptive conduct. What do you say? And that has been, I think, a very powerful signal with that delegation occurring, and has enabled ASIC to reach out in ways that they may otherwise have had to been a bit more cautious about, because there is certainly very little guidance in terms of Australian published cases. We look to American decisions and draw analogies. We don't have a Howey test here. We simply have our Corporations Act and prescribed things, which may or may not fall under securities, depends on the features. Our catch-all investment contract, if you will, is called a managed investment scheme, which is very similar to the collective investment scheme regime in Singapore. So there's a whole lot of things to look at before you can decide whether or not something might be a security. And so that's a really useful tool that I think ASIC has, and has certainly helped the Australian marketplace by sending a clear message that what is really important here is people not being misled. It doesn't, whether or not something is a security is important for licensing and investor protection, but the starting point, even if you were coming from that traditional financial sector, is still making sure what is said isn't going to mislead anyone, because that is where a lot of the problems come from. A hallmark of all of scams and projects that fail is often that they have promised more than they can deliver and didn't have a basis for making those claims. And so we're really lucky in Australia to have that kind of protection.
And I think you mentioned briefly about scams, to be fair, because a lot of people's first, Bitcoin again has been around for almost 10 years. So a lot of people's first, news of this new technology was basically it's being used for nefarious activities on, Silk Road and all these things. And it was. And so we're still kind of seeing all these new and amazing use cases going and will further change the world. So I think you mentioned previously that Nigerian scam, and you were mentioning the Elon Musk scam earlier. To put things into context, how much is that the Nigerian scam? It's still ongoing, and I don't think it's going anywhere soon. It's probably using some type of cryptocurrency now. But how much has that actually raised? It's something astronomical.
Oh, it's huge. But the Nigerian scammers never use cryptocurrency because they target poorly educated and older folks. I remember reading, I think you had the fantastic number on our recent panel, but the number of people in Queensland, for those American viewers, our Florida, a sunny place where a lot of people go to retire, but the number of retirees who are targeted by that is quite significant. And once the money goes offshore, it's very hard to track because of the way foreign exchange has worked. Blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies are only pseudonymous. Even some of the privacy coins really don't have anywhere near the privacy protection that people think that they do. Or if one part of the chain of transactions is exposed, the amount of privacy protection drops dramatically. Chainalysis' CEO did a great podcast interview on Unchained recently, where he discussed just how many suspect wallet addresses they were able to locate. And I noticed in other reports, so-called mint or freshly minted Bitcoins in China carry a price premium because they haven't been through any wallets that might be tainted. So I think that the amount of scamming going on has dramatically fallen. There's wallets with billions of dollars of Bitcoin, but the funds can't be moved out of them because they're firmly associated with the old days of the Silk Road. So I think that certainly Bitcoin was used in the very early days on the Silk Road, but all of those transactions are visible. And as people are identified to wallets, that record's there forever, and they can be tracked down. And in many cases, there is no statute of limitations on some of the crimes that the payments were involved in. And financial crime prosecution is really just about catching people for the proceeds of crime and the laundering of money. And we're all familiar with the famous, Al Capone wasn't never really hunted down for the crimes he was associated with. It was the fact that he didn't pay his taxes, and the money he had from all his criminal enterprises, how he was undone. And I think there's been a movement in law enforcement to go for that, because the evidence that's required to prosecute someone for, say, importing of drugs is reliant upon witnesses turning, other documentary records that are hard to get hold of, versus showing where money has come in, unexplained wealth, or money coming in from convicted criminals or known as people associated with that, is much easier evidence-wise to put forward. I mean, there was a lady just arrested, I think it was in the news this morning, who had spent something in the order of, I think it was £16 million over 10 years at Harrods, at the same Harrods in London. And her husband, of course, was previously the head of a Far Eastern, I think it was Afghanistani bank, perhaps, or one of the Central European countries, Central Eastern countries, where there was a whole lot of fraud at the central bank. And so this unexplained wealth being identified through traditional means is easier in the blockchain sense. So I think that the way that financial crime and anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing will be prosecuted and tracked will be assisted greatly by blockchain. And I do not think it is anywhere near as useful a tool for people to perform illicit transactions on than cash. Cash still reigns supreme. To give you an example, there's something in the order of 1.5 trillion in money laundering suspected globally from 2011. So update that to today, the growth it was undertaking is probably 1.8 trillion. That is a significant multiple of the total cryptocurrency market cap now. And as we've moved on over time, the amount of cryptocurrencies that's suspected to be involved in illicit transactions is dramatically fallen. Or as I say, if you think cryptocurrencies are used for money laundering, just wait till you hear about this thing called cash. Criminals prefer cash. Cash is a lot easier to conduct illicit transactions in. There may be some use of crypto, but one of the first uses for sneakers was almost undoubtedly running away from the police after a crime was committed. That doesn't mean we should ban sneakers or have undue regulation around them. It just means we recognize that technology is agnostic as to what it's used for. And it's the people who are using it and the purposes it's put to which matter.
And technology is still in the very early days of adoption and understanding, and we have a new infrastructure that we're still kind of, still being inverted. I often talk about, when horse and carriages were kind of reigning supreme, and these cars came along into muddy roads covered in horse manure, front wheel drive, and they got bogged. Everyone laughed, and it wasn't until you flipped it around the infrastructure that you had this inversion of infrastructure that cars could run on it, but also horses and also roller skates and also scooters and all kinds of lovely things. And that same thing happened again when we had phone lines and we were trying to stuff internet data down them. It wasn't the best infrastructure for that. And when we flipped it around and had data lines that could have run phones through it, you could actually have CD quality phone conversations, and all kinds of things could actually go through that new infrastructure. And now you've got this new infrastructure called blockchain technology that's under, a new way of doing commerce, a new network protocol that we can create trust digitally. And it's still clunky because we're putting the old world through this kind of new infrastructure and putting things like BSB numbers and account numbers to send to an exchange to get cryptocurrency and then send back to our accounts and to our wallets to go then use on a centralized platform. So we're kind of building this old infrastructure on this new thing we have, and that will happen for some time, but only when we harness the real power of this new infrastructure. I think that's when we'll finally realize that there's something quite powerful here that is actually far more efficient. And again, we're just building all those on-ramps and all that kind of stuff. So let's not get too bogged down into it. I mean, legal is doing a big part of that. We're positioning ourselves as blockchain infrastructure for the future of legal services. So going back to those trust technologies, we're essentially just trying to build these trust technologies that let lawyers and clients work together, but in new ways that are far more efficient and in a more peer-to-peer manner, so saving costs there. So where do you see, Michael, as a lawyer that's immersed in this industry? And sometimes we can get a bit siloed, but what do you think the next 5 to 10 years is going to look like? Just for yourself in terms of a lawyer, what are the things that you're going to be kind of wrestling with? What are the things that are going to be the new innovations? How do you see this next 5 to 10 years playing out for you?
I think in terms of impacting the legal industry, I think that lawyers are going to increasingly be dealing with clients who are building or deploying smart contracts and blockchain tech, and they're going to need to understand how that's going to change disputes. Disputes around two different ledger and reconciliations between companies will change dramatically when they're using a common ledger. So we may see the face of dispute work change dramatically, shifting from that kind of approach when we know from a shared system what has been done to where disputes might lie in the contract elsewhere. I think that law is just slow to adopt technology full stop, and the advancements we've had in law tech are fantastic in the last couple of years. I've been waiting for my whole career to have these kinds of programs available to us. It just means law firms take a while to adopt these things. So I think that what's going to happen is there's going to be that bit of the generational shift of younger lawyers coming in who are more comfortable with this technology and want to drive that efficiency, and businesses that are going to take advantage of blockchain to lower their cost of delivery. So I don't think we're going to see widespread pure disintermediation of lawyers and other business. I think that we're going to see blockchain being used as an efficiency and automation tool, bring down the costs. Those who do it early and do it well will then be able to enjoy higher margins or preserve their competitive advantage, and those who don't may then go to the wall because they won't be able to compete. And that's just part of any technology that comes along. Those who ignore the internet in the retail space, and we don't need a website, we don't need to sell through this channel, have come to regret those words and had to rush to join later. And blockchain's no different to that. It's those who put it to work in a smart way will do well, and the legal industry is no different. I think that there's a real chance that we'll be starting to see these kinds of escrow, software escrow arising, and we'll need law societies to get on board with that. We might even ultimately see trust accounts where there's real-time audit capabilities for law societies or auditors to come in and check the trust account and prevent fraud on the part of lawyers, or internal signing of authorizations and signing of transactions by lawyers using their smartphone with a fingerprint reader on an internal system. So many deployments. So I think we'll see within the organizations that lawyers work for, their clients, and within those clients as well as the dispute space. I think it's going to impact everything in the next 5 to 10, if not sooner. In the next couple of years, I think we're going to see a lot of stuff in the security space with the rise of security exchanges and blockchain tech trying to find a way to work with the existing financial services regimes to help continue to unlock funding for projects in a way that also gives investors protections and perhaps brings some of that 24/7 global liquidity that investors have been waiting for.
Well, that's getting replaced tomorrow. So, but I better let you get back to doing what you're good at. And so, just a few parting shots to get us on our way. But are you an Android, Windows, or an iOS kind of guy?
I'm Windows at work and iOS at home.
All right, so it's kind of like you're torn between the beautiful UX and kind of.
I'm trapped in the beautiful walled garden.
Yeah. Okay. So apart from your phone, what other bit of technology what's your kind of go-to thing that I know that you can't live without? Is there a bit of tech that you kind of tie to?
I think from a hardware perspective, the Apple TV has probably replaced the cable box and a whole lot of television. It's quite extraordinary the change that's happened with that, and for having small children in my household, being able to pull that kind of shows they like up on demand and give them what they'd like is just fantastic. From a software perspective, I find LinkedIn has become a fantastic social media for blockchain, and the ability to stay in touch with those lawyers and other leaders in that space through a social media platform which doesn't have a reputation for fake news and generally is pretty sensible. It certainly has, and that piece of technology, I think I have to recognize, helped me when I first started in blockchain, because I just connected with everyone who had profile in the space then and just messaged them. And it's a fantastic platform that you can reach out to people so easily and get a response. And it's we haven't seen that. Email, you don't have that with anymore. People get too much in the way of email, but and I'm not sure LinkedIn planned to do that when they first started off, but they've just ended up as a really nice social platform where it's really easy to get rid of people who are just trying to sell you stuff, but it's really fantastic to push out content and find new content as well. So that's probably something that I have as it's almost a relaxing daily ritual, that one of the first things I do when I get into the office is to say, all right, what's happening? I'll check LinkedIn feed and some other social media, see what's going on and see what's worth my connection to.
Well, these algorithms are quite smart these days, where they can actually almost curate your, your news. Again, sometimes you'll be careful, like in some social platforms, you get siloed. But I think, when I think about it in terms of, I get more accurate, again, not fake news, but more accurate news in a professional sense, because the people that you connect with and interact with, the algorithms get smart and they know what you're interested in, so they can automatically show you kind of what's happening. It just gives you such a good cross-section, again, from people working on startups, new technology, and all the way to the major kind of news. So that's good. And again, the world's become a very small place, and I think the blockchain community is pretty tight-knit, and it's I've been spending a lot of time myself traveling, and the world is, you go somewhere on the other side, we're in Malta, and you meet someone face to face for the first time. It's like you've known them most of your professional career, so it's pretty awesome. One more thing, Mike, is there any, apart from, you mentioned you go swimming, it kind of keeps you sane, a good way to kind of dive in the ocean and cleanse yourself, get away from the clients for a little while. But is there any other kind of rituals that you have that kind of, I guess, keep you kind of somewhat sane as a high-powered lawyer, kind of, in a very stressful environment?
Look, I build in some exercise every day to try and just have, I think it's so easy as a lawyer to be trapped behind a desk and have so many emails and so many phone calls that you're non-stop. So I've sort of structured my commute that I can have a walk through our botanic gardens here in Sydney every day, or unfortunately, if it's late at night, through the domain next door, which is not quite as pretty, not quite as many flowers. The Botanic Gardens is obviously one of the oldest botanical setups in Australia. It was originally set up by the early settlers, so it's got this, it's tremendous in summer. It's 5 degrees cooler there, and it's ferns and beautiful old trees, and it's just another world when you then are coming out from the zone of skyscrapers. So even if it's a pretty crazy day, I think just heading out and having a little walk at lunchtime in a green environment and not being on the phone and being a little bit separated, I think is really important. It's similar to swimming in that you disconnect, let your brain rest, and come up with some of its best ideas and strategies when it has a little bit of downtime, and also in that different environment that's a bit closer to nature.
It's funny that it's such a therapeutic thing to settle your thoughts and
that's right.
So that's awesome. All right, Mike, we better let you get back to it. It's been awesome chatting with you, and looking forward to following your journey and also the development of this blockchain space. It's so exciting. And so thank you for jumping on and sharing your insights with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Stevie. It's my pleasure.
Speak to you soon.